Did critics completely misread some of the grittiest war movies of the 1970s? Some called them messy, cynical, too bleak, or too strange. But veterans saw something critics often missed: the exhaustion, the dark humor, the bad leadership, and the quiet damage that follows soldiers home. These 11 films were not polished war trophies. They were bruised, angry, and uncomfortable. And the final one may be the harshest of them all. Kelly's Heroes, 1970. The strangest thing about this war movie is that its biggest joke feels uncomfortably close to the truth. Kelly's Heroes takes World War II, strips away the parade music, and asks a dangerous question. What happens when exhausted soldiers stop believing in glory and start chasing survival, profit, and one impossible score behind enemy lines? Clint Eastwood plays Kelly with that cold, quiet confidence, but the film's real bite comes from its cynicism. This is not a clean battlefield story about noble speeches and perfect orders. It is a muddy, sarcastic, rule-breaking mission where the men on the ground understand the war far better than the officers above them. Critics at the time often treated it as too odd, part combat film, part heist movie, part anti-authority comedy, but that strange mixture is exactly why it sticks. Veteran audiences could recognize the dark humor, the boredom between danger, the ridiculous commands, and the way soldiers create their own private logic when the official mission stops making sense. Donald Sutherland's oddball turns the whole thing into a cracked military fairy tale, but underneath the laughs is a sharp truth. Sometimes war is so absurd that comedy becomes the only honest language. As a gritty 70s war film, Kelly's Heroes does not salute the system. It laughs in its face. Force 10 from Navarone, 1978. This is the kind of war movie critics called unnecessary, but action fans and military-minded viewers kept alive like a secret mission report. Force 10 from Navarone had a difficult job from the beginning. Follow one of the most respected adventure war films ever made and somehow make the mission feel dangerous again. Critics were quick to call it a lesser sequel, a rougher, louder, less elegant return to familiar territory. But that roughness is also part of its strange appeal. The film throws together sabotage, betrayal, prison camps, shifting loyalties, and men who do not fully trust each other but still have to survive together. Robert Shaw brings a hardened authority. Harrison Ford adds sharp-edged impatience. And the story keeps pushing its soldiers through a landscape where the mission is never as simple as the briefing room promised. For veteran viewers, the attraction is not perfection. It is the blunt rhythm of men under pressure, forced to improvise when plans collapse. The film understands that war missions are often messy, confusing, and dependent on personalities as much as strategy. It may not have the prestige of its predecessor, but it has grit, sweat, and old-school military camaraderie. Force 10 from Navarone is not a flawless classic. It is a battered war machine that still knows how to move. The Eagle Has Landed, 1976. A Nazi commando plot to kidnap Winston Churchill should have collapsed into pure nonsense. But somehow, this film turns a wild idea into a tense soldier story. The Eagle Has Landed was never going to please every critic because its premise sounds almost too outrageous. A German unit secretly lands in England during World War II, hoping to snatch Britain's most famous leader. On paper, it feels like Pulp Fiction wearing a uniform, but the film survives because it treats its soldiers with more complexity than expected. Michael Caine's Colonel Steiner is not written as a cartoon villain. He is tired, disciplined, conflicted, and strangely human, a professional soldier trapped inside a monstrous cause. That moral tension gives the film its grit. Critics could complain about the implausibility, but veteran audiences often respond to the way the movie separates duty, politics, and personal honor without making war feel clean. The mission is dangerous. The village setting becomes a pressure cooker, and every disguised smile carries the threat of sudden violence. Donald Sutherland adds eccentric energy, while the film builds suspense through small mistakes, suspicion, and loyalties cracking under stress. It is not the most realistic war plot of the decade, but it understands one battlefield truth. Soldiers are often sent into impossible missions by men who will never face the bullets themselves. That is why this strange thriller still marches harder than expected. Too Late the Hero, 1970. Some war movies make heroism look glorious. This one makes it look like a punishment nobody asked for. Too Late, the hero drops its characters into the Pacific Theater during World War II and immediately strips away comfort, romance, and battlefield glamour. This is not a clean mission filled with patriotic certainty. It is a tense, sweaty jungle nightmare where men argue, panic, distrust each other, and slowly realize that survival may matter more than any medal. Critics at the time were not always kind to its bleak tone and grim pacing, but that harshness is exactly what gives the film its staying power. Michael Caine plays a reluctant British officer, while Cliff Robertson brings American toughness with a weary edge, and together they move through a story where courage is never simple. The jungle becomes more than a location. It becomes a trap, swallowing orders, confidence, and sanity. For veterans, the film's power comes from its refusal to make every soldier noble or every command wise. It shows the ugly tension between duty and self-preservation, between following orders and knowing those orders may get everyone killed. The title itself feels like an accusation. By the time the film reaches its bitter turns, heroism does not feel like triumph. It feels like the last desperate act of men abandoned by strategy, luck, and leadership. The Boys in Company C, 1978, before the Vietnam War became a prestige movie battlefield, this film dragged viewers through the grinder with no soft music and no clean escape. The Boys in Company C follows young Marines from brutal training into the chaos of Vietnam, and its strength is not in spectacle, but in exhaustion. The film watches idealism get shaved down, shouted down, and finally beaten into something bitter. Critics sometimes dismissed it as rough, familiar, or overshadowed by bigger Vietnam films. But its bluntness is the point. It feels less like a polished statement and more like a dirty barracks story told by men who still remember the smell of wet uniforms and bad decisions. R. Lee Ermey, himself a former Marine drill instructor, gives the training sequences an authority that feels almost too sharp to be acted. The film understands the strange comedy of military life, the insults, routines, absurd rules, and nervous laughter before terror arrives. For veterans, that mix of dark humor and dread is often more truthful than speeches about patriotism. The movie also shows how young men are shaped by a system before they ever see the enemy. By the time Company C reaches the battlefield, the real damage has already begun. This is not a heroic march into history. It is a warning about what war does to boys before anyone bothers to call them men. Who'll Stop the Rain? 1978. The war is technically over in this movie, but its poison has already crossed the ocean. Who'll Stop the Rain is not a traditional combat film, and that is exactly why it belongs here. It follows a Vietnam veteran pulled into a drug smuggling scheme, but underneath the crime thriller surface is a darker story about what happens when war follows soldiers home and turns ordinary America into another kind of battlefield. Critics did not always know what to do with its mixture of noir, paranoia, Vietnam fallout, and broken morality. But veteran audiences could recognize something painfully real in its atmosphere, the sense that nobody returned untouched and that the country waiting at home was not prepared to understand what had changed. Nick Nolte gives the film a hard, haunted physical presence, playing a man who looks like he has survived too much and trusted too little. The story moves through betrayal, fear, corruption, and restless anger, showing a post-war world where the lines between soldier, criminal, victim, and survivor blur. Its grit comes from silence as much as action. Nobody is clean. Nobody is safe. Nobody seems fully back from the war. Who Will Stop the Rain is powerful because it refuses to end the Vietnam story at the airport. It argues that some wars keep fighting inside people long after the shooting stops. Go Tell the Spartans, 1978. This is the Vietnam movie that does not roar. It stares at disaster before the disaster becomes official history. Go Tell the Spartans takes place during the early years of American involvement in Vietnam, before the war became the giant national wound everyone later recognized. That makes it especially chilling. The film is not about massive helicopter assaults or famous battles. It is about advisors, bad intelligence, fragile outposts, confused strategy, and men slowly realizing they are standing inside a mistake no one in command wants to admit. Burt Lancaster gives one of his most tired, grounded performances as a military officer who has seen enough to understand the shape of failure before younger men can name it. Critics sometimes found the film too bleak, too small, or too downbeat, especially compared with louder war dramas. But that restraint is its weapon. Veteran viewers have often respected it because it captures the mood of futility, orders arriving from above, danger rising from the ground, and soldiers trapped between politics and survival. The film's tension does not come from spectacle. It comes from watching smart men recognize that courage cannot fix a broken mission. Go Tell the Spartans feels like a warning sent too late, a quiet battlefield obituary for every soldier pushed into a war that leadership barely understood. Its bitterness is exactly why it feels honest. The Deer Hunter, 1978. This is not just a Vietnam film. It is a movie about the people war leaves behind, even when they are still breathing. The Deer Hunter begins far from the jungle, in a Pennsylvania steel town where friendship, work, weddings, hunting trips, and small rituals make life feel solid. That opening matters because the film is not really asking how soldiers survive combat. It is asking what happens when combat destroys the world they expected to return to. Critics and viewers argued fiercely over its politics, its Russian roulette imagery, and its emotional extremity. Some saw melodrama, others saw a nightmare version of trauma that felt impossible to ignore. For veterans, the film's power often comes from the aftershock. The blank stares, the broken conversations, the way home becomes familiar and alien at the same time. Robert De Niro plays control turning into silence. Christopher Walken becomes a ghost trapped in damage, and John Savage carries fear in his body. The war scenes are brutal, but the real wound is what follows. The film understands that survival is not the same as recovery. It also understands how communities can love their returning men without knowing how to save them. The Deer Hunter is controversial, uneven, and devastating. But once it gets under your skin, it feels less like a movie and more like a scar that keeps reopening whenever the music stops. A Bridge Too Far, 1977. This is the rare epic where the title tells you the ending before the battle even begins, and still the failure feels unbearable. A Bridge Too Far turns Operation Market Garden into a massive, star-filled military machine. But underneath the spectacle is one of the most sobering lessons in war cinema. Courage cannot rescue a bad plan forever. Critics complained about its length, its crowded cast, and its almost documentary-like sprawl. But that sprawling structure is also why military history viewers keep returning to it. The film shows war as coordination, confusion, ambition, weather, timing, personality, and tiny mistakes multiplying into catastrophe. Sean Connery, Michael Caine, Anthony Hopkins, Gene Hackman, and James Caan all appear inside a story where no single hero can control the outcome. That is the point. The paratroopers are brave, the commanders are confident, the objective is clear. Yet every mile becomes heavier because the plan depends on too many things going right at once. Veterans respect that kind of honesty because the film does not pretend battles are won by speeches alone. It shows logistics, intelligence failures, exhausted men, broken communications, and the tragic gap between headquarters optimism and frontline reality. A Bridge Too Far is not slick victory propaganda. It is a giant, expensive warning. Sometimes the men fight well, and history still punishes the plan with cruel precision, no matter how brave the soldiers were. Apocalypse Now, 1979. Some war movies explain the battlefield. This one makes you feel like the battlefield has swallowed the mind of everyone inside it. Apocalypse Now is not a simple Vietnam combat story. It is a fever dream about power, madness, fear, and the strange moral collapse that can happen when war removes every normal rule. Early reactions were divided because the film felt chaotic, excessive, symbolic, and almost impossible to pin down. But that chaos became its identity. The journey upriver is not just a mission to find Colonel Kurtz. It is a descent through different versions of war. The helicopter attack staged like an opera, the nightmarish bridge, the terrified young soldiers, the commanders who speak in slogans, and the jungle that seems to absorb reason itself. For veterans, especially those who understood the absurdity and sensory overload of Vietnam, the film's surreal style can feel more emotionally truthful than clean realism. Martin Sheen's Captain Willard is not a heroic guide. He is a hollow observer moving through a world already broken. Marlon Brando's Kurtz becomes the final question. What does war create when nobody is left to stop it? Apocalypse now may exaggerate reality, but it captures something terrifying beneath reality. It is not about winning a battle. It is about staring into the machine until the machine stares back and smiles in the dark, waiting for another order. Cross of Iron, 1977. If most war films polish the battlefield into legend, Cross of Iron drags that legend through mud, blood, panic, and pure human exhaustion. Sam Peckinpah's Eastern Front nightmare does not offer the comfort of easy heroes or clean patriotic meaning. It follows German soldiers fighting a collapsing war against the Soviet advance, but the film's real enemy is not only the opposing army, it is ambition, class arrogance, command vanity, and the machinery of war grinding men into meat. Critics in America were often harsh, and the film struggled commercially, but its reputation grew because it has the smell of a battlefield few movies dare to enter. James Coburn's Sergeant Steiner is not noble in the polished sense. He is hard, cynical, capable, and disgusted by the officers who treat soldiers like pieces on a board. Maximilian Schell's Captain Stransky wants medals more than truth, and that conflict gives the film its bitter spine. Veterans respond to Cross of Iron because it understands the frontline soldier's anger, the feeling of being used, watched, ordered, and sacrificed by men far from the worst danger. The combat is chaotic, loud, and deeply unromantic. Even survival feels temporary. That is why it earns the #1 spot. Cross of Iron does not ask viewers to admire war. It dares them to endure it without comfort, escape, or patriotic decoration. And that is why it still hits harder than most victory films. These films were not always neat, heroic, or easy to praise. And that is exactly why they lasted. Critics saw messy stories, strange tones, and uncomfortable politics. Veterans saw bad orders, dark humor, fear, loyalty, and damage that does not end when the shooting stops. Which of these gritty 70s war films deserves the most respect today?